Did you know the very first illegal immigrants in America were actually Americans themselves? Or that U.S. officials once spent millions of tax dollars literally measuring the circumference of people's skulls to mathematically test their criminal potential? Forget every sanitized, boring paragraph you were forced to read in your high school history class. Today, we are stripping back the wallpaper and exposing the absolute dumbest, most bizarre, and genuinely heart-stopping facts about the history of U.S. immigration. We are talking about a government that sprayed human beings with toxic bug chemicals, forced grown adults to play with toddler blocks to prove their worth, and turned the golden door into a high-stakes gauntlet of medical horror and bureaucratic insanity. This isn't just history. It's a guided tour through a century-long national fever dream where the line between policy and clinically insane was basically non-existent. Number 1. The Great Banana Crisis, a tropical welcome to hell. Imagine the scene. You have just spent 18 grueling days in the steerage hold of a massive steamship. You haven't seen the sun in a week. You smell like a combination of coal smoke and 300 other unwashed people, and your stomach is a hollow pit of despair. You finally shuffle onto the docks of Ellis Island, expecting the streets to be paved with gold, and instead, a well-meaning volunteer from a local charity hands you a bright yellow, violently curved, leathery object. You're a farmer from a tiny village in the mountains of Poland or the sun-baked hills of Sicily. You don't know what a banana is. In your desperate hunger, you do the only logical thing. You take a massive, aggressive bite right through the bitter, thick, waxy peel. Imagine the collective horror of thousands of immigrants standing in line, their teeth sinking into the dry, fibrous outer skin, their faces contorting in pure disgust. They must have thought, is this it? Is this the American dream? Eating bitter yellow cardboard? The situation became so widespread and so chaotic that it triggered a literal banana crisis for the port authorities. Inspectors and charity workers had to stop their actual jobs to engage in a massive, improvised game of charades. They stood on crates, frantically pantomiming the act of peeling a banana to crowds of hundreds, trying to save these poor souls from mass indigestion and a lifelong hatred of fruit. It was the world's most awkward culinary welcome to the neighborhood, and it perfectly set the tone for the confusion that was to follow. Number 2. The original illegal Americans, border jumping into Mexico. Today, the political world is on fire over the southern border, with endless talk of walls, fences, and illegal crossings. But if you hop into a time machine and head back to the 1820s, the entire script is flipped in the most ironic way possible. At that time, the territory we now call Texas was 100% owned, operated, and controlled by the sovereign nation of Mexico. The Mexican government actually wanted people to move there, but they had very specific rules. You had to become a Mexican citizen, you had to be Catholic, and you had to follow their laws. American settlers looked at those rules and said, absolutely not. These pioneers began flooding across the border by the thousands, totally ignoring Mexican immigration laws, setting up their own illegal towns, and refusing to learn the language or follow the customs. But here's where the irony gets truly dark. Mexico had officially abolished slavery in 1829. These American migrants, however, refused to give up their property and began systematically smuggling enslaved workers across the border into Mexico, hiding them from authorities like modern-day contraband. The Mexican government was absolutely livid. They realized they were losing control of their own territory to a wave of illegal aliens from the north. They desperately tried to build military border forts and pass exclusion acts, specifically to keep the Americans out. The foundation of the Lone Star State wasn't built on a legal permit. It was built on massive, organized, and defiant border jumping. Number 3. The button hook, the eye torture of the elite. If you made it past the banana fiasco and the initial questioning, you were funneled into the medical inspection lines. This was essentially a traumatic speed run of your entire physical health, but nothing struck pure, unadulterated terror into the hearts of new arrivals quite like the eye man. Doctors were desperately hunting for a disease called trachoma, a highly contagious eye infection that caused blindness and meant an automatic, non-negotiable ticket back across the ocean. The problem was that the U.S. government, in its infinite wisdom, didn't provide these doctors with actual medical equipment. Instead, the doctors reached into their pockets and pulled out a common household tool, the button hook. This was a piece of cold, curved metal, normally used to yank stiff buttons through the tiny holes of Victorian-styled boots. These doctors would take that hook, which had already been used by 1,000 people that morning, and shove it directly under the immigrant's eyelid, violently flipping the lid completely inside out to check for red bumps. It was agonizing, it was unsanitary, and the worst part? The doctors frequently wiped the hook on a dirty towel or their own coat sleeves between patients. If you didn't have an eye infection when you stood in that line, you had about a 50% chance of catching one from the very doctor who was supposed to be protecting the country. This wasn't health care, it was a state-sponsored gauntlet of medical horror.
Number 4. The Haskell Library, the border that doesn't exist. While most of the history of immigration is defined by steel fences and armed guards, there is one place on the map that treats the concept of a border like a hilarious practical joke. Built in 1904, the Haskell Free Library and Opera House sits directly on the line between Stansted, Quebec, and Derby Line, Vermont. The architects didn't just build it near the border, they built it right on top of it. A thick black line is literally painted across the floor of the reading room and the stage of the Opera House. This means you can walk through the front doors in Canada, stroll past the front desk, and sit down in an armchair that is technically in the United States. You don't need a passport, you don't need a visa, you don't have to talk to a single armed guard. You can legally enter America to read a book and then exit back to Canada for lunch. The building is a legal nightmare for bureaucrats. It has 2 different mailing addresses, 2 different phone numbers, and 2 different sets of emergency services. If you have a heart attack on the left side of the room, you get a Canadian bill. If you fall over on the right, you're paying American prices. It is a living, breathing glitch in the matrix of international security, proving that if you put a big enough library on a border, the government eventually just gives up and lets people read in peace. Number 5. The $25 bill scam, wealth via sleight of hand. The United States government has always been obsessed with the idea that immigrants shouldn't be poor. They were terrified of public charges, people who might arrive with no money and end up needing government charity. To prevent this, inspectors at Ellis Island implemented a rule. Every head of a household had to show at least $25 in cold, hard cash to prove they could survive. To a peasant fleeing a famine-stricken village in 1895, $25 was an astronomical fortune, the equivalent of several months or even a year's wages. But humans are, if nothing else, incredibly good at cheating the system. A brilliant, low-budget black market emerged right under the noses of the federal inspectors. Immigrants who were total strangers to one another would huddle in the holding pens and pool their tiny scraps of coins together until they reached exactly $25. One man would take the money, confidently flash it to the inspector to get his entry stamp, walk through the gate, and then, here's the kicker, he would secretly slip the money through a crack in the wooden fence or pass it back through a window to the next person in line. That single legendary $25 bill would admit 50 different people in a single afternoon. The government thought they were filtering for the wealthy and prepared, but they were actually just selecting the people who were the best at teamwork and criminal deception. It was the ultimate fake-it-till-you-make-it entrance into American society. Number 6. The skull-measuring scientists, state-sponsored phrenology. In 1911, the U.S. government decided to stop relying on simple questions and start relying on hard science. They formed the Dillingham Commission,
a massive federal project designed to prove that the new wave of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe was inferior to the older, pure Northern European stock. But they didn't just look at economic data. They hired scientists to literally measure the physical dimensions of people's heads. They used a debunked pseudoscientific field called phrenology. They believed that the shape of your skull, the height of your forehead, and the bumps on your cranium could mathematically predict whether you were a genius or a natural-born criminal. They published a staggering 41-volume report that actually claimed Italians, Jews, and Slavs were biologically prone to violence and low intelligence because their skulls weren't the right shape. They spent millions of taxpayer dollars trying to prove that you could tell if someone was going to be a bad citizen just by using a pair of metal calipers. It was a terrifying era of mathematical racism that successfully shaped U.S. policy for decades. If your head was a little too wide or your brow a little too low, the government of the United States officially labeled you a biological threat. Number 7. The toxic kerosene baths of El Paso. While the East Coast was dealing with skull measuring and button hooks, the southern border in El Paso, Texas, was turning into a scene from a dystopian horror movie. In 1917, the local mayor became convinced that Mexican workers were bringing typhus into the city. The response was a policy of forced disinfection that was as humiliating as it was deadly. Every day, thousands of Mexican men and women who crossed the bridge for work were forced into the bathhouse. They were stripped completely naked, their clothes were shoved into giant steam ovens where they were often ruined, and their bodies were blasted with a cleansing mixture of vinegar, kerosene, and even sodium cyanide, the base chemical for Zyklon B. These people were literally being doused in highly flammable, skin-melting chemicals just to go to their jobs as maids and laborers. In 1917, a 17-year-old girl named Carmelita Torres finally had enough. She refused to get in the bath, stood in front of a trolley, and sparked a massive citywide riot. She became the Red Rose of El Paso, a teenage girl who stared down armed guards to stop the government from spraying people like they were infested cockroaches.
Number 8. The name change myth. Blame the shipping clerks. We have all heard the classic family legend. Great-grandpa arrived at Ellis Island with a long, beautiful name, but the lazy inspector couldn't spell it, so he changed it to Smith or Miller right there on the spot. It's a great story, but it is 100% fake. The inspectors at Ellis Island were actually highly trained professionals, many of whom spoke 4 or 5 different languages, specifically so they wouldn't make mistakes. They didn't invent names. They worked off the official ship manifests provided by the shipping companies in Europe. If your family name was changed, the crime didn't happen in New York. It happened thousands of miles away in the chaotic ports of Naples, Bremen, or Liverpool. It was the overworked shipping clerks back in Europe who scribbled down whatever phonetic nonsense they heard over the noise of the docks. By the time that piece of paper reached an American inspector, the name was already mangled. These clerks were the original autocorrect fails of history. They were tired, they were bored, and they just wanted to get to their lunch break. Your entire family identity wasn't stolen by a guy in a blue uniform in New York. It was accidentally erased by a guy who couldn't hear over a steam whistle in 1890. Number 9. The 100-mile Constitution Free Zone. Most people think that once they're on U.S. soil, the Fourth Amendment, the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, protects them completely. But thanks to a bizarre legal loophole created by the Department of Justice in 1953, the Border Patrol has extraordinary powers within a 100-mile radius of any external boundary of the U.S. When you look at a map, you realize how insane this is. An external boundary includes the entire coastline. This 100-mile border zone covers nearly 65% of the entire U.S. population. It includes the entire state of Florida, the entire state of Maine, almost all of California, and cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia.
Inside this invisible net, federal agents can legally set up checkpoints, search vehicles, and demand papers without the traditional warrants that the rest of the country requires. It is a massive, invisible, constitution-free zone that effectively turns two-thirds of the American population into border residents in the eyes of the law, whether they live near Mexico or in the middle of a high-rise in Manhattan. Number 10. The Great American Deportation of Americans. During the soul-crushing years of the Great Depression, the U.S. was looking for someone to blame for the lack of jobs. They turned their sights on Mexican Americans. In a massive, terrifying campaign called the Repatriation, the government began rounding up hundreds of thousands of people and shoving them onto trains headed for the border. They told the public they were just sending foreigners back home. But here is the horrifying, brain-melting truth. Historians now estimate that up to 60% of the people deported were actually legal, natural-born U.S. citizens. These were people born in Los Angeles, Chicago, and San Antonio. They were Americans who had never even been to Mexico. They were kids who didn't even speak Spanish. The government was so desperate to look tough that they literally kidnapped their own citizens and dumped them in a foreign country during a global economic collapse. It remains one of the most forgotten and shameful, unhinged moments in our history. Proof that when the economy goes south, the government's definition of citizen becomes very, very flexible. From the Red Rose of El Paso fighting off chemical baths to the thousands of people who accidentally ate banana peels because they didn't know better, the history of the American border is a chaotic, tragic, and often hilarious circus of human desperation and bureaucratic failure. Your great-grandparents didn't just arrive in America, they survived a gauntlet of skull measuring, eye hooking, and $25 magic tricks. So be honest with yourself. If an inspector handed you a wooden toddler puzzle right now after a 3-week boat ride and told you that your entire future depended on it, would you pass, or would you be stamped with a chalk X and sent back to the old country? Let me know in the comments which of these facts blew your mind the most, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more historical madness.